Our scripture was read into our hearing this morning. Again, we took it from Genesis, chapter 45, verses 8 through 10. Will draw our attention in this moment. We read 8 through 11, but I just want to read it to you one more time. If you don't mind, I'm going to share it with you from the Message translation. Again, Genesis chapter 45, beginning at that 8th verse, you'll find these words written. The text tells us, "So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. Yes. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Haste ye, and go up to my father, and say unto him, Thus saith thy son Joseph, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not. Thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there will I nourish thee, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all thou hast come to poverty." The word of the Lord is already blessed. I want to talk to you for just a few minutes this morning with the subject that guides our thoughts and the direction that we go. And that subject is their pain had a purpose. Their pain had a purpose. Earlier this year, I spent a few months at St. Francis Medical Center. I was working overnight on their patient mobility team. And our primary responsibility was to visit a roster of patients that was provided to us each evening when we got there, working midnight shift from 11 to 7. When I got there, there would be a list of patients who needed to be visited during the course of the overnight period, every 2 hours. And we visited those patients for the purpose of repositioning them. These were patients who were unable to turn themselves. They were unable to turn themselves because they were in an induced coma. They were unable to turn themselves because they were in the final stages of palliative care. They were unable to turn themselves because of their experience of chronic pain. Many of us here today have been involved in one form or another in the care of a loved one. Whether it was a grandmother, a grandfather, an uncle, a spouse, or even a child, we know how important it is to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. And we've seen the effects of bed sores. And so our purpose in coming into their rooms on a regular basis was to help prevent bed sores from developing. All right. Now during my training, I worked with this wonderful young brother named Tyler, young guy with dreads. And when you first see him, you know how we are. We're quick to judge people based upon appearances. One of the most intelligent and compassionate young people I've ever met in my life. Every time we went into a room, Tyler would address the patient by name with respect. It was always Mr. Even if we were allowed to use their first name, it'd be Mr. Tommy or Miss Geraldine, whatever the case may be. And when he went in the room, he would explain to the patient and to the family what he was about to do. All right. On the flip side of that coin, I worked with some people who did not explain what was being done and why it was being done. See, in those circumstances, I've seen families become very upset at the repositioning team. And because very often when we go in there, sometimes the repositioning of a patient causes pain. Ain't that right, Sister Linda? Yes, it causes intense pain. And I remember one man in particular who had cancer that had metastasized into his hips. And while he was on morphine, the morphine only reduced the level of the pain. And whenever he was moved, he would scream in pain. One day his daughter was there, and she became very upset. And so while Tyler was moving, I took her out of the room, and I explained what we were doing. You know, and because teammates before had not explained, it looked like we were there to hurt the patient. The apparent pain the patient experienced in being moved might have appeared cruel to the family. It might have appeared cruel to those friends who had gathered there, praying and mourning over the patient's condition. But most of the time, we had family and friends who understood the importance of this function of repositioning a patient, making sure that they don't spend too much time on that right hip bone, that left elbow, that left hip bone, that left shoulder, because a constant pressure on those particular points will create a bed sore. And the discomfort that they went through in being repositioned had an overall benefit right there. That the discomfort, that minimal discomfort they went through in that particular moment in time had an overwhelming benefit that outweighed the temporary pain. Paul put it like this. Paul said, well, I reckon that my present sufferings are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in me. Yes, sir. Lord have mercy. See, the pain had a purpose. Yes, sir. Very often in life we go through some things. And while we're going through, we're told to trust in God. We're told to continue to hold on to our faith. We're given instructions on what we should do. But what do we do with what we feel? Yes, sir. I come to know that God knows us inside and out. And when he shaped us in our mother's womb, he knew the emotions that were attached to us. He knew the shortcomings that were part and parcel of us being a human being. God was fully aware of what we would go through. Lord have mercy. In our text today, we're invited to a private listening party. It's a listening party that includes the second in command in Egypt. Only Pharaoh had a higher position, and his brothers. And this is not your average discussion between brothers. They're not going to be talking about Sunday's football lineup, you understand. They're not talking about the World Series race. They're not talking about politics. They're not talking about the family reunion that's coming up in September. But this is a dysfunctional family. A dysfunctional family that had some healing to be done. Joseph was born at a significant time in the life of Jacob. Israel is what God renamed him. The scriptures tell us that Israel loved him most because he had been born in his old age. Yes, sir. I think a deeper search of the text might reveal something else to us as well. See, Rachel was Jacob's first and true love. The Bible tells us that he fell in love with her the moment he laid his eyes upon her. Yes, sir. And that he loved her so much that he worked 14 years to win her hand from her father. All right. Worked 14 years. The man told him, if you work 7 years, I'll give it to her. But when it came and the 7-year period was up, he positioned his older daughter, Leah. He said, it would not be right for the older daughter to be unmarried and the younger daughter married. And because he loved her so much, he worked another 7 years to get her hand. Lord have mercy. In spite of their best efforts, Rebekah had not borne Jacob any children. That's why Rachel had not borne him any children. Finally, she had Joseph. He was born in Jacob's old age. But then she became pregnant again, this time with Benjamin. And the Bible tells us that she died while giving birth to Benjamin, and that Jacob never recovered from that level of grief. In his grief, some say that Jacob displaced the affection that he had for his wife, and he lavished it on his son Joseph. I want you to know today, my friends, that grief will make you do some strange things. That an unrecognized and unaddressed grief, a short-circuited grief. That's what I call it. You know, when people tell you you've been in mourning long enough, you need to take that black veil off. When they tell you you've been in mourning long enough, you need to go to a football game. You need to go out and enjoy your life. People will short-circuit your grief process with their expectations.
Yes, sir.
Look, if you're going through, you keep going through.
That's right.
But I believe that on the other side of grief is healing.
Yeah.
On the other side of grief is a reconciliation, an emotional reconciliation that you make within yourself. That on the other side of grief, there is peace that passes all understanding. But if you let anybody interrupt that grief process, you find yourself stuck right there. Stuck with no peace. Stuck with no feeling of being able to move on. You find yourself, don't let them short-circuit your grief process. If it takes you 30 days longer than it took your sister, so be it.
So be it.
If it's 30 years and you're still grieving, so be it. God is faithful, my friend. God won't leave you in that lonely place. When you come up alongside you, not only will he come up alongside you, but he'll send friends who have walked through what you have gone through. He's going to tell you today, my friends, God is faithful. Faithful.
Yes, it is.
So she became pregnant again, and she died while giving birth to Benjamin. And he lavished all of this affection on his son Joseph. And so this affection, this favoritism, oh boy, you want to talk about creating dysfunction in the family. And you start with favoritism.
Yes, you do.
You want to talk about creating dysfunction in the church, you start with favoritism. There's a certain expectation that we have that in life we're to be treated fairly by human beings. There's an understanding that each and every one of us has deep within inside our being, an understanding of that which is fair and that which is not fair. And look, like I told Bible study class this past week, we're in Romans chapter 10, or chapter 9 rather. Drop by if you're not doing anything on Wednesday. We talked about God being just.
Yes.
God being just. What just means is that his declarations, his meted justice is always right.
That's right.
But it ain't always fair. It ain't always fair. See, God is not beholden to us to be fair. He is God, and beside him there is no other. He is a sovereign God. He's an omnipotent God. He is a God that created this entire universe and everything that exists within it. There is nothing created today that has not been created out of something God created in the beginning. Sold him into slavery. And they returned home with the tatters of this beautiful coat that their father had given to Joseph, a coat that had been dipped in goat's blood to make it appear as though he had been slaughtered by some wild animal.
Yes, sir.
And so there was provided for the father a moment of closure. You understand? That if they came home and they just said, we can't find Joseph, well then they would have spent the rest of their lives looking for him. But they created this scenario where they were able to brush Joseph off, to sort of discount his memory, to sort of make him less than he really was, because he was alive and they made him dead. Well, we find three important things. I'm about to take my seat. I ain't gonna preach long today, y'all. The first thing we find is a God faithful from the beginning. From the very beginning. See, what you must understand is that Joseph had a purpose on his life already. That God had destined him for things. The boy would have dreams. And in one particular dream, there were 12 sheaves of corn. These sheaves of corn represented the sons of Israel.
That's right.
And that the 11 other sheaves were bowing down before Joseph's sheep. Joseph made the mistake of telling somebody about his dream. He made the mistake of telling his brothers about his dream. Sometimes when God gives you good news, you need to keep it to yourself. Sometimes when God tells you what the blessing is going to be, you need to keep it to yourself. Because not everybody's going to know that. successful. Not everybody's going to be jumping up and down because God is blessing you. They don't understand that if God is blessing you, he's in the neighborhood and their blessing is on the way.
Yes, sir.
They don't understand. Preachers don't even see is what they want in this particular moment. And so he made the mistake of telling his brothers that their seed were bowing down to him in his dream, that the planets were rotating around a particular item, and he was that item. So, are we supposed to bow down to you?
Yeah.
The irony of that will be revealed to you as we go further in this. God was faithful to him from the beginning.
Yes, sir.
God is faithful to you. He will order your steps. And look, those ordered steps aren't always going to take you traipsing through a rose garden.
Talk, preacher.
Those ordered steps aren't always going to have you walking down well-paved roads. Those ordered steps sometimes will take you places where the asphalt is all cracked up.
Yeah.
Sometimes those ordered steps will take you places where folk don't care too much about you.
Yes, sir.
But as long as your steps are ordered by the Lord, as long as you find yourself operating within God's tender will, as long as you're where he wants you to be, God is faithful. Yes. From the beginning.
Yes,
Preach
he
it.
is.
You understand? Preach it. See, Joseph didn't get in trouble, and God became faithful. But God was already faithful from the beginning. And what I need you to understand today, my friend, is that the same principle. You might not be a Joseph. Joseph was not an extraordinary guy. Joseph was just an ordinary guy who served an extraordinary God. God did the extraordinary things in his life. Didn't he, Reverend Hicks? It was God that did those extraordinary things. Joseph didn't do nothing but what God told him to do. He stayed still and he waited on the Lord. And the Lord wasn't faithful just when trouble came.
Yes, sir.
You understand? The Lord was faithful from the beginning to the end. And that very same principle applies to you and you and you and you and you today. God has been faithful to you. Even when you didn't know it,
Yes.
God has been faithful.
Yes.
You have gone through both seen and unseen dangers.
Yes, sir.
Now we recognize seen dangers, and we ain't got no problem with God helping us with those. But what about those unseen dangers?
Yeah.
What about that time you were going down the steps in the ice storm and your foot slipped a little bit, and you realized in that little baby slip just how bad it could have been?
Yes, sir.
You realized in that moment, that time you went to get in the bathtub and your foot slid just a little bit, but you realized in that moment just how bad it could have been.
Yes,
God is faithful from the beginning. Oh, thank you, Lord. Next thing you need to know, my friend, is that Joseph was faithful as well. Joseph was faithful. Joseph was faithful even as he went through the fire. He held on to his faith. I can understand what Joseph went through. He went from a life of luxury, his father's favorite, to being sold into slavery. While he was sold into slavery, he languished in jail. And it was not anything but a series of circumstances that God orchestrated that got him out of jail. He got out of jail, been through some things. He finally is in the high note. He's made Lord at Potiphar's house. He's running things for Potiphar. As a matter of fact, he's done second in command at Potiphar's house. He's running all the business.
Yeah.
And look, Potiphar's wife,
Oh, make it plain, preacher.
he catches her eye.
Make it plain.
I remember Reverend Dr. Richard Swan, who was a pastor at Jerusalem Baptist Church up north in, I think it's Hanover, up in Ashland. He preached from this particular text, which was an earlier text. It was the encounter with Potiphar's wife that he preached about. And he said, sometimes, my friends, you got to learn how to flee from sin.
Yeah.
He said, a good run is better than a bad fight, isn't it? He said the boy came out of his coat. He left his coat there in order to get away from it. See, what he was concerned about, he wasn't concerned about what Potiphar thought of him.
That's right.
He wasn't concerned about advancing in Potiphar's household. He wasn't concerned about what the rest of Egypt might think about him, but he was concerned about what God would think.
That's right.
You understand what I'm saying? He could have snuck away and got away with anything. If Potiphar wasn't at home, his wife dug him. He could have done the deed and gone on about his business, but he was concerned about what God would think of him.
Yes, sir.
And look, there's some stuff you can get away with. There's some things you can get by with. But the Bible tells us that everything we do, we ought to do it heartily as unto the Lord. And the reason we're to do it heartily as unto the Lord is because the Lord sees all, knows all. He is a witness to everything we do.
Yes, sir.
Our integrity has to mean something.
Yeah.
Our commitment to the things we say we stand for has to mean something.
Yes.
Integrity is like character. It's the thing you do when nobody else is watching. Reputation is what everybody else can see. But your character is the things you do when nobody else is looking. Your character is your attention to details based on the fact that you know God is watching what you do. Man, too often we become content with our half-hearted efforts. And I'm not coming down on anybody, you understand what I'm saying? I'm just offering a mirror for you to take a look at.
Yeah.
It is God's expectation that we give him our blessings.
That's right.
God wasn't slacking when he gave to us. When he extended to us the very best thing.
That's right.
The very best thing, his son Jesus, which was nothing less than a part of him. It's as though he took a part of himself, divested of it, and put it down on the table and said, I put that there for your benefit. It's the very best I got. And what I expect from you is the very best you've got. Whatever you're doing, do it heartily as unto the Lord. If you're working on a job that you don't even like, do it heartily as unto the Lord. If you're in a relationship, if you're married and you're struggling at the moment, remember, you're not just married to one another, but you're married to God as well. Do it heartily as unto the Lord. Whatever you do it heartily as unto the Lord. So God was faithful from the beginning. And the response from Joseph was to mimic that faithfulness to God.
Yeah.
Look, we love him because he first loved us.
That's right.
There was a reaction created as a result of that moment. Finally, I'm going to take my seats here. When we look at the text, we see this interesting thing happen. So, you need to know the story of Joseph.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you the condensed version. That Joseph's brothers were stopped. There was a famine in the land. And their family was about to starve. They were dispatched by their father to Egypt. When they got to Egypt, they were taken to the second in command. See, Pharaoh was too busy to deal with things like that. Pharaoh was too busy to deal with the day-to-day stuff. He had a second in command. That second in command was Joseph. And so the brothers were taken to Joseph and didn't recognize him. It had been 20 years since they sold him into slavery. He'd been through some things in those 20 years. He spent so much time in jail, I believe he might have had scars that he never had before.
That's right.
I believe he might have had bruises and bumps that he never had before. But what he looked like didn't matter because of who he was. And so, my friends, on their third trip to Egypt, Joseph has twice had to run away from their presence in order to cry.
Right.
That he felt so emotional in seeing his brothers. And finally, on this particular trip, he is there. He's the second in command of Egypt. And so all of Egypt is there with him. All of Pharaoh's household, all of them are there. And it's him and his brothers. And he dispatches everyone else from the room. He sends everybody else out. And he begins to weep. He weeps so loudly that the folk he sent out could hear him outside the room. And he exposes himself to his brothers for who he is. He tells them, I am your brother.
Yeah.
And he proves to them that he is their brother. And you know what the response of his brothers were? They quaked in fear.
Yes, they did.
The Hebrew word that is used said it's akin to being flabbergasted, speechless,
Yes.
and afraid.
Yes, sir.
Y'all know why they was afraid.
Yes, sir.
They took this young boy,
Yes, sir.
beat him up, threw him in a cistern, and then sold him into slavery. And I know some of your shouting moment is when we get to chapter 50 in Genesis, when Joseph said, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. I know that's our shouting moment, but I see you today, my friends,
Yes,
that there's a moment here in chapter 45 we need to take notice of. That in chapter 45, when given the opportunity to return blow for blow, in chapter 45, when Joseph, who is second in command in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, Joseph, who could have dispatched their heads with but a flick of his hand, Joseph, when he had the opportunity to take advantage of or to realize his vengeance, Joseph told him, don't be afraid.
That's it.
Sun Tzu,
That's it.
who wrote the book of the Art of War,
That's it.
a Chinese general more than 2,000 years ago. It's one of the most quoted books, second to the Bible, in the world today. And there's this one book that has always resonated with me. It says, when you have your enemies completely surrounded and ready for defeat, you always leave them a way out. And you know what that's called, my friends? That's called grace. That you always lead them a way out. See, Joseph had experienced God's grace. And because he had experienced God's grace up close and in person, the only thing he could do was return grace. And I want you to know, my friends, that each and every one of us in here today has been a recipient of God's grace. That when we see our friends who are not doing well, that we don't hold them in judgment, but we extend grace to them. When you could squash a bug and you let the bug go, you know what I'm saying? That we got to learn how to be gracious to one another. Look, the law is handed down by Moses.
Yeah.
It tells us one particular point. It's an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.
Yeah.
Now understand this, that was not a commandment, but that was a limitation.
Yes, sir.
You understand? What's the difference, Pastor? Well, the difference is this. God wasn't telling the people that if somebody costs you an eye, you should take their eye. And if somebody costs you a tooth, you should take their tooth. And if somebody costs you a life, that you should take their life. That's not what God was telling. God was telling them that there are limitations in your reaction to what has been done to you. That in the days before the law, if somebody lost an eye, somebody made sure there was no balance in between what was done and the response. But what did Jesus say? Jesus said that's not even for us to do. And if somebody slaps your cheek, you offer them the other cheek. That if somebody forces you, wants to force you to walk a mile, as the Roman army could do when putting somebody in conscription, that you go ahead and walk 2 miles. That God extended grace towards us, and that we extend that same grace to those we come, whether it be our enemies, whether it be our loved ones, whether it be our brothers and our sisters. We have got to learn to be gracious with one another. Remember that we ain't going through simply to entertain God. That there is a purpose in our pain. You understand that Joseph was not ready when he was released from that cistern and sold into slavery. Joseph was not ready to be second in command. See, God's ultimate plan was to have him second in command. Not so that he might be glorified, not that people might look at him and tell him what a good job he's doing, but he had him in this position because God knew what was coming.
Yes, sir.
God knew what was coming. Preacher, and he had him in this position so that he could be the provider for his family when the time came. And that what he had been through in his life up until his slavery had not prepared him for what God was calling him to do. I want you to know, my friends, that God is always preparing us for the call that he has placed upon us. And there is a purpose in the pain you go through. God is molding you, God is shaping you, God is creating you into that new instrument that is useful to him.